This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Turkey. I'm your host, Ahval editor David Lepeska, and with me today is Sinem Adar, researcher at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP. Hello, Sinem, and thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me.
You are welcome. We are talking on April 20th, about 40 days since Turkey reported its first coronavirus case. It now has more than 86,000 cases, seventh most in the world, and more than 2,000 people have died in Turkey. The Turkish government and President Erdoğan have been widely criticized for a coronavirus response that many have seen as sluggish and uncertain. Last week, Turkey's Interior Ministry launched criminal investigations against Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu and Ankara Mayor Mansur Yavaş in response to both mayors' municipal fundraising campaigns meant to help contain coronavirus. In comments to the Al Monitor news outlet, you said, quote, "The methods used to disempower local government are being deployed with even greater ferocity during the COVID-19 crisis." Please, if you could, Sinem, please give us a bit of background on that and explain what you think President Erdoğan hopes to achieve with these investigations and other methods against the municipalities.
Mm-hmm. I think the COVID crisis, in a way, is accentuating what has already been happening in Turkey in terms of the central government trying to undermine local governments. We see that first with the appointment of government trustees mainly in the Kurdish southeast and east. And after the March 31st elections, that kind of expanded into the main Istanbul and Ankara metropolitan municipalities as well, especially after they basically won the elections.
Last March, a year ago, yes.
March 31st, 2019, and then the rerun of the municipal elections in June 2019. So in a way, what has been happening in the case of the corona crisis is kind of like an extension of the already existing practice of the central government trying to undermine the local government. So in a way, it's interesting that the central government announced that it will start a donation campaign in support of the corona crisis. But actually, both Istanbul and the Ankara metropolitan municipalities had already started their own donation campaigns a couple of days before the announcement by Erdoğan. So in a way, on the one hand, you see that the central government trying to compete with the local governments. And on the other hand, what I said earlier, that it's trying to undermine them, in a way, constantly sending them the message that I own the local as well. So I am, as the state, everywhere. So you cannot function without me, or you cannot do anything that could be perceived by me as a challenge.
Mm-hmm. From where I sit here in the United States, I'm reminded of the way a number of mayors and governors here have been verbally jousting with President Trump over corona response almost on a daily basis. It's partially a political game here and in Turkey as well, as you said, but it's also right now about life and death. I mean, it's more than likely that more residents of Ankara and Istanbul will contract COVID-19 and more people will die because Erdoğan and the AKP government have barred these municipalities from collecting donations. I wonder, do you think the residents of these cities appreciate that? How are Turkish citizens responding to this marginalizing of key leaders during the pandemic, particularly in the country's hotspot, Istanbul?
Mm-hmm. I don't think they do. And I think one thing that the COVID crisis, because I think it's a moment where you wouldn't expect the discourse of polarization,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't expect a polarized discourse. But what has been happening has been exactly the opposite. Like the central government has been using this polarizing discourse to kind of undermine and even exclude local governments from providing help, providing services to citizens. And we also, it's not only in Istanbul and Ankara, for instance, in Eskişehir, where the Republican People's Party, metropolitan municipalities in the hands of Republican People's Party, the central government, CHP, the central government stopped the soup kitchens that has been run for a while by the local government. So there is basically no logic for any of these decisions. And I think at this point, it is actually revealing more than any time in the past the political legitimacy crisis of the government, central government. So in that sense, I think this doesn't really ring well with the citizens.
Right. There's been a lot of talk about a legitimacy crisis facing this government, Erdoğan in trouble, waning popularity. I just wonder, how serious is all this talk when Turkey has no elections scheduled until late 2023? I mean, a lot can change in 3.5 years, right?
I mean, obviously, none of these mean that there is going to be a political change tomorrow. Even if it has become, I think, clearer with the COVID crisis that the central government has been losing legitimacy. But I think it shows something very important to citizens, but also to the international audience, that the current government in Turkey has increasingly been losing its maneuvering space. So, even in the way that it has been managing the COVID crisis, basically it's almost like a series of tactics rather than a well-planned, well-thought strategy to kind of deal with the consequences of this crisis. So I think it would be naive to say that this would immediately translate into a political change, but I think it would also be slightly too much to ignore this crisis that has been kind of coming onto the surface.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of which, it all started just over a year ago, as you mentioned before. Erdogan's AKP lost several key cities to the main opposition party, CHP, in local elections, and many observers ascribed those defeats to widespread resentment against the presence of some 3.5 million Syrian refugees. Turkey's recent military intervention in Syria's Idlib province, where a Russia-backed Assad regime offensive aims to retake the country's last rebel-held territory, is mainly about keeping another wave of Syrians from crossing into Turkey. We will get to Idlib and to Syria in a minute, but first, the SWP report you co-authored this month details how some refugees in Turkey have been pressured to accept a, quote, voluntary return to Syria. I wonder, how many Syrians do you think have been repatriated or deported in this way? And is that practice still continuing today? Please tell us a bit about it.
There have been allegations by human rights organizations about Turkey having refugees, sending refugees back involuntarily to Syria. The UNHCR numbers is around like 87,000 between 2016 and 2020. I mean, it's obviously impossible to know the exact numbers, so we need to rely on the numbers provided by the UNHCR. But given that refugees, so two things. On the one hand, that Turkish government has been very systematically and consistently announcing to the world that it wants to send refugees back to a possibly Turkey-controlled, quote-unquote, safe zone area in Syria. So it doesn't have the intention or the motivation to keep Syrians in Turkey. On the other hand, I think there has been also a growing unrest within the population against the Syrian population, to the extent of basically some commentators argued that the loss of the significant metropolitan municipalities in the recent local elections has also been partially because of this growing unrest. Because, as you know, Turkish government has basically applied this open door policy until 2015 and has been quite friendly and hospitable to Syrian refugees, to the extent of Turkey today hosts around 3.6 million Syrians. That is basically the largest number of refugees that has been hosted in the world. So it is, I think, quite of a big, in a way, accomplishment that the Turkish government did. But this came with the consequence of this growing unrest within the population. Because of these two reasons, Turkey has been very much willing to send these people back. So for that very reason, I think these allegations are also, I mean, it's fair to assume that a sizable portion of the refugees weren't sent back voluntarily. Again, we don't have accurate statistics, so we need to rely on the UNHCR. It might be more than that, we don't know. But according to UNHCR, the number of people who were repatriated between 2016 and 2020 is around 87,000.
And do you think this is still continuing today, or do you think it has stopped? Because Turkey controls, a good stretch of territory within Syria.
Yeah, it is hard to tell. It might be continuing. It's really hard to tell. Like it might be or it might not be, but it might very well be continuing. Yeah.
Okay. The SWP report I mentioned is focused on the plight of some 3 million refugees and displaced people in Syria's Idlib province, on Greece's Aegean Islands, and along the EU's external borders. And it examines in particular how the European Union might respond to this fast-developing humanitarian crisis. The piece argues that the Turkey-EU deal of 2016 has major weaknesses and a more comprehensive approach is required, all the more urgently during this pandemic. So please, if you could tell us a bit about what drove the 2016 refugee agreement between Turkey and the EU, what it entails, and how it has fallen short.
The statement, it's known as the EUTurkey statement, and it was agreed in March 2016. That was basically, it's kind of came after the joint action plan that was again signed in November 2015 between Turkey and Europe. And the main purpose is to create a framework of cooperation between Turkey and Europe over migration management. So Turkey, to put it very simply, Turkey was responsible from keeping the borders secure and not letting irregular migrants to pass to Europe. And in exchange for this, EU promised Turkey financial aid, a 6 billion euro financial aid that would be paid in 2 tranches. And to basically the resumption of the accession negotiation talks, modernization of customs union, and visa liberalization. And of course, there is also the repatriation and resettlement part of the statement, which basically says that for every irregular migrant that passed from Turkey to Greece, one refugee that was waiting in Greece would be sent back to Turkey. And within the course of 3 years, around 72,000 of refugees will be resettled from Turkey in Europe. So it's basically an agreement, again, over a cooperation over migration that has to do with securing borders, that has to do with repatriation, and that has to do with resettlement.
And well, in the months after the deal, migrant arrivals to Europe, particularly to Greece, fell sharply, and many thought this was because of this one-to-one mechanism, which signaled to Syrians in Turkey or elsewhere that even if they successfully reached Greece, they would be returned to Turkey. But as you detail in the report, as of this January 2020, only 2,000 people have been returned to Turkey from Greece, but tens of thousands have arrived on the Greek islands. Your report describes the conditions in camps on those islands as catastrophic and calls on Europe to help Greece process a huge backlog of asylum requests and empty out those island camps. What's the issue here? Why have Greece and Europe not been able to fulfill this part of the deal, and how can it be fixed?
Yeah, the one-to-one mechanism was not very successful. And I mean, one of the basic successes of the statement, as it is perceived in the public, is that it significantly declined the number of irregular border crossings. But research actually shows that, well, it is true that there was a decrease in the number of irregular border crossings after the statement came in March 2016. But research also shows that it might very well be due to weather conditions, improved humanitarian situation in Turkey, and increased border controls on the so-called Western Balkan route that came before March 2016. And the reason why there was the situation in the camps in Greece right now is that they are extremely overcrowded. So at the end of 2015, basically the camps, they are called the hotspots, were meant to accommodate just over 6,000 people, but currently there are 41,000 people in the camps. So this is partially due to the ways in which the asylum process was working in Greece. So it has been really slow in putting the asylum applications into process. So that kind of like led to an increase in the number of refugees stuck in the camps, and brought us here.
And how the report argues that Europe should help Greece process these requests and empty these camps out. Can that happen? How might that happen? What needs to change for that to happen?
Well, the fast processing of the asylum applications require more stuff on the ground. I think there is already indications of that. And emptying the camps, there have already been discussions about basically creating facilities in the mainland. But of course, one, I think, very necessary and important point is that European countries should accept, and they already started, basically the 7 countries already started accepting, for instance, unaccompanied minors, but they should basically be more willing to and ready to transfer refugees, first from basically refugees from camps to mainland, and then from mainland Greece to other European countries. That's the only way to basically decrease the burden on Greece.
The report argues that it is in Europe's interest to help compensate the main host countries of Syrian refugees, in particular Turkey, which, as you said, is hosting by far the most Syrian refugees, something like 3.6 million, to keep refugees from being returned to Syria, to ensure a certain level of training, education, and services. The report argues that Europe should provide additional funding to Turkey. But in providing more funding, in addition to this initial 6 billion from 4 years ago, I wonder if it sets a bad precedent. Isn't there a risk that more funding will convince Erdoğan that methods like the weaponization of refugees, which he did last month, are effective?
Yeah, it might. There is always that risk, but unfortunately, there is also not another way. So I think there should be multiple things happening at the same time. One thing is that I personally think that the EU-Turkey statement making the EU-Turkey statement in March 2016 was not a very right decision. But once the decision was taken and all the logistical, organizational, and institutional structures are set, it is right now very difficult to undo them. So I think, realistically speaking, we might basically think on an idealistic level differently, but realistically speaking, I think it is the cooperation between Europe and Turkey over migration management is there to stay. But if we accept that assumption or the statement, then the next question we should ask then how the situation could be better for the refugees, right? And as I said earlier, Turkey hosts the largest number of refugees in the world, and I think it's fair to ask more financial support, especially given now the economic crisis, already bad economic crisis in Turkey is going to get worse in the midst of the COVID crisis. And so I don't think Turkey can alone manage improving social, economic, and political participation of refugees who are likely to stay in Turkey. So that's one thing. Now, your question about whether this basically kind of like sets a bad example, it might, but I think it's really important to kind of not to turn the issue into a kind of like an Erdoğan versus Europe conflict. I mean, it's obviously very clear that Turkey has been instrumentalizing refugees at each and every instance that it found. And in a way, it's also kind of like used refugees to cloak its foreign policy ambitions under humanitarian goals. And I think leaders in Europe are quite aware of this fact. But as I said, there is also at the moment, as long as Europe remains divided when it comes to common asylum policies, there is no other option.
Turkey has used force along its Syrian border to keep people out. And last month, many were surprised to see Greek authorities act aggressively to keep out migrants along its land and sea borders, with Turkey even firing tear gas and live rounds. A key European leader proudly called Greece Europe's shield. Were you surprised at the aggressiveness of Greece's response and the EU's support for it? What did it say about Europe today? To some extent, we might expect this sort of behavior from Erdogan's Turkey, but less so from the European Union, I'd say.
Yeah, I was surprised. I mean, on the one hand, I was surprised, of course, because the reaction that was triggered by Turkey's recklessness to act upon the threat to open the borders. In a way, I mean, these two, the action and the reaction, let's put it that way, I think risked undermining the principles or the gains of the last almost like 50 years since the aftermath of the Second World War, when a kind of this international refugee system was established. So basically suspending the asylum applications or using violence at the borders not to let refugees in. Of course, it was basically not only surprising, but I think it was also very sad in terms of what I said earlier, in terms of undermining all the legal gains of the last like 50 to 60 years. But at the same time, I think exactly because of what I said earlier, that Europe remains divided about forming a common asylum policy, and basically the rise of xenophobia, populism, anti-migrant sentiments, etc., etc. It was also kind of, I think, I mean, expected is too strong of a word, but I wasn't very surprised that they were very adamant not to let anyone in. And now, Turkey also knew that. Turkey also knew that, and Turkey used that.
Now to what many see as the most serious humanitarian crisis today in Idlib, where some 2 million displaced people are squeezed between Syrian troops and the Turkish border, and where the healthcare system has been totally destroyed by sustained Russian and Syrian airstrikes. This massive displacement area in Idlib, as well as the Greek island camps, are seen as places where COVID-19 would likely be devastating. And a top UN official said a week or two ago that an outbreak in one of these camps is probably inevitable. Your report calls on the EU to immediately provide aid and emergency shelter for those at risk in Idlib. How might this be done, and could that sort of aid be sustained for a longer period?
Yeah, it can be done with the cooperation. First of all, the UNHCR, and then, as we also mentioned in the report, World Health Organization, World Food Program, and international NGOs, but also Turkey. But there is also one very essential thing that has to do with Russia allowing humanitarian aid going into Syria, because Russia, in the last United Nations Security Council meeting, basically together with China, vetoed cross-border access for humanitarian aid. So that's basically very essential that Russia should be pressured to ensure that cross-border access for humanitarian aid. So that's the only way that aid can be delivered to IDPs and those who are in need.
Mm. But as you acknowledge in the report, the corona pandemic is pushing humanitarian aid to the back burner for Europe, for the UN, for the WHO as well. Do you foresee the necessary political will and funding for Idlib emerging in the coming weeks as EU states deal with their own domestic crises?
That's true, but I think it's also in the interests of Europe. It's not even basically at this point kind of like a humanitarian question. Obviously it's a humanitarian question, but I think it's also security interests of Europe to basically help the IDPs in Syria. So I think that a lot of politicians within the EU are aware of that.
Right, these 2 million displaced now in Idlib. We've detailed how unwelcome they are in Turkey at the moment. In the European Union, many fear another wave of refugees would further boost the popularity of rising far-right parties, which have in recent years thrived on their anti-immigrant messages. So going to Europe isn't really an option for all of them. They can't go home because many of these displaced in Idlib are seen as anti-Assad, as rebels, and would not feel safe under his rule. Your report calls on the EU to support the establishment of a joint Turkish-Russian safe zone in Idlib with the condition, or at least one of the conditions, that it not be used to repatriate refugees from Turkey, which is actually exactly what Erdoğan has proposed, building housing for 1 million or more Syrians it hopes to return from Turkey. So how do you envision this safe zone?
First of all, it is in northern Idlib, so it has nothing to do with basically the Turkey-controlled areas. So it's basically in northern Idlib, and given that basically even now the ceasefire that was agreed between Turkey and Russia on March 5 it seems to be a temporary one, and it's basically probably is gonna things are gonna get heated at some point.
Right, there have been reports that the Assad regime is planning to relaunch its offensive.
So we are basically probably gonna face another wave of internal displacement. So that's why it's necessary to have, and given also the fact that Turkey-Syria border remains closed. So Turkey built a wall starting in 2015 or 16, and that wall was completed by 2018. So right now the Turkey-Syria border remains completely closed, and Turkey doesn't have any intention to let more refugees in. So that means that some sort of a solution should be taken within Syria itself, and that's why we basically recommend the establishment of a safe zone by, of course, Russia and Turkey. They both should be convinced to do that. And I even think, and that's where I disagree, not necessarily disagree, but a little bit like I word away from my co-authors, that I am even sympathetic to entertaining the idea of creating such a safe zone under international protection. For instance, via an EU-NATO cooperation, because that might also be a way to prevent Turkey from connecting such a potential safe zone with the other areas that it controls in northeast Syria, for instance, because obviously that's Turkey's ultimate goal, to create basically a safe zone that has been basically lying at the Turkey-Syria border and to which that it repatriates refugees. Now, it's very clear, I think, Turkey's basically military efforts and occupation of land in northeast Syria is considered within Europe by a lot of people as violation of international law. So I think that's also important to kind of like differentiate when people recommend, when the recommendation for a safe zone in northern Idlib comes, it doesn't mean that that is also a support for Turkey's safe zone aspirations in northeast Syria. I think they are very two different things, and there is a very clear stance within Europe not to basically support efforts of Turkey in northeast Syria. But yeah, that's
this area that you're suggesting for a safe zone in North Idlib. Who controls it? Is it not controlled by Turkey?
Well, so basically in the report we recommend that it will be established by Russia and Turkey, and then and of course the promise should be that it needs to be unmilitarized, like it is the case according to international law about any safe zone. It needs to be unmilitarized and it needs to be open to the vulnerable.
No, I mean, but right now, who controls that territory? Is it Turkish controlled? Is it rebel held? Is it Assad regime?
No, I think it's probably UNHCR.
Oh, right now.
Or North Idlib, but I'm not sure. That I need to check.
Okay, I see. Okay.
I need to check, but I don't think it's Turkey. But I need to check that. I'm not sure.
And you would be willing to call for EU and NATO observation of this, unlike your co-authors, you're saying?
I personally think that might be an option to be entertained, at least, because as I said, like the danger of leaving the establishment of such a safe zone in northern Idlib to only Russia and Turkey might also kind of giving leeway to Turkey to like make a bigger claim over other territories, and by connecting the safe zone in northern Idlib to the areas that it controls in northeast Syria. But of course, that means that the international community should militarily engage, and I don't think there is much sympathy for that.
Right. Sinem Adar from the Center for Applied Turkey Studies. Thank you so much for your time and insight. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.